So people are now commenting on how leg extensions are not a good quad exercise. This is something I brought up multiple times to you, and I will continue to bring it up until people are no longer saying it, although that might be a very long time or forever. So while people are currently saying it, I'll just point out first and foremost that this is a claim that originally I heard from Milo Wolf. Okay, so just gonna name names. It's anyone who's listening to this who has heard him make this claim also probably knows that he makes similar claims. And at this particular time, I think I've given up on trying to, in some ways, remain totally sort of out of the naming game. I think that at a certain point, we need to hold people responsible. Ethan, I'm not tying you into this any battles here. So for anyone listening, Ethan didn't know what I was going to say. He's not a part of this, but in some sense, he is a witness. So sorry to do that to you. Um, but anyway, so this sort of like leg extension claim, uh, just in brief, comes from the sort of extrapolations that people in the science-based space are currently making, which all sort of ultimately lead back to this long muscle length thing, this claim that one needs to, in order to maximize hypertrophy, stretch the muscle as much as is humanly possible, pretty much under all conditions forever. And I just want to use this as an opportunity to talk about some of the other variables in exercise that are important because I think that if you make a claim like leg extensions are a bad quad exercise, well, then what you're really saying is that there are other options that we should do instead, right? And so someone like Milo will list other options like the Nordic leg extension or the reverse Nordic. I think it's called the reverse Nordic, where you basically are, shins on the ground and your whole body is kind of leaning backwards, and you're basically doing like a leg extension where everything from your knee up is moving as opposed to everything from your knee down. And so Milo will make the claim that like this is, basically the quad exercise that you should use. And pretty much the entire basis for this argument is rooted in a sort of single variable analysis, right? And what it does is it kind of looks at all of the exercise variables that we have and throws pretty much all of them away apart from this one, which is muscle length. And so I had a conversation with someone recently where they asked me, well, Ben, like, if these other variables are so important, like, what are they? Can you just list them for me? So I want to just kind of list a couple of the other variables that one needs to consider when making exercise choices. Because again, when everything gets distilled down to this one sort of fascination with how long a length of muscle is being trained at, we oftentimes will sort of miss the forest for a single tree, so to speak. So the first and sort of most obvious one is comfort, right? So like I don't know many people who can sit on their ankles comfortably, right? Just for starters. I certainly can't. I know I know you definitely can't sit on your ankles comfortably, right? Like in a plantar flex position. And a lot of people who are muscular probably can't either, right? And the people that can would probably also prefer their ankles not to be smushed in something like a reverse Nordic. Like it's just not a particularly comfortable position for most people, in my experience, to sit in. Now, of course, you can sort of, elevate the shin so that the foot is less problematic. But ultimately, right, you have to, in addition to the fact that your knees are in this sort of folded up position, manage other things with the motion. So that brings us to another variable, which is not just this concept of comfort, but also of coordination, right? So on a leg extension, you sit down, you can pretty much take anyone from an 80-year-old who's post-op to, you who's on the IFBB stage, and you can say, hey, like, just you see this pad right here, like you just like put your shin, behind the pad and you start kicking the pad, and like voila, you have a nice sort of quad exercise. It's very simple to set up, and there's sort of very few complications in my experience that people have when doing leg extensions. Like there are nuances to it, of course, like anything else, but the coordination demand is very, very low. And so the threshold for stimulus, specific to the quads, in my opinion, in this case, also tends to be low, right? When the coordination demands are low. It's kind of like someone, sitting down on a chest press machine that fits them well and just kind of like pressing against the handles. It's like, man, the target here is really, really massive. Whereas when we move toward exercises that involve greater coordination demands, many other joints moving, many other muscles loaded, now we're moving into territory where coordination demand is higher. And so, that sort of target, so to speak, becomes a bit smaller. And then I'll just briefly mention some others that I have written down here. One of them is just sort of anchoring and counter forces, right? The whole stability conversation, which overlaps with this directly. And then we have other things like loadability and progressibility. So what do you do, for example, when you get to a point where you can do 50 of these reverse Nordic reps? Perhaps you can add load. Maybe you hold a plate and lean back. But at bottom, it's an exercise that at some point probably has some kind of load limitation, and that also couples closely with the concepts that I already talked about in stability and the coordination, right? Because something, let's say in a reverse Nordic, may actually become more of a challenge for something like your abdominal muscles, right? As you're leaning back all the way into that bottom position as compared to the knee. The knee and the balance component sort of conflict in that sense. And then again, just like other things to consider, like connective tissue health in terms of people's exposure to that position, how comfortable people are in that position, how much you can actually adjust the motion in terms of the amount of options you have. Right, on a leg extension, you can change the hip angle super easily. You can change the pad placement easily. You can change the range of motion easily. And with something like the reverse Nordic, we have, I think, some things to toggle with, right? The position that we sort of align our shins, how low we go, whether or not we use an assistance, right? But clearly, again, at bottom, there are differences in terms of all of those variables and how all those variables relate between those two things. And I think that to distill an exercise down to how long of a muscle length it happens to train is short-sighted. And again, I wouldn't have any problem with the claim that it's helpful to include longer length training at some point. But I do have a problem with the claim that leg extensions are bad. And this conversation is, really meant to be directed toward the person who's maybe doesn't have all of the sort of information in their head to make these kinds of connections and decisions. Because a lot of people, I think, will hear that claim and just sort of not take it seriously at all to begin with, which, to be honest, is as useful as a strategy as understanding all these variables, depending on sort of who you are. So, with all that said, Ethan, I think this trend applies to many different exercises, and I've talked about it a lot, but I will again continue to talk about it as long as I'm getting questions about it, which I am on a regular basis. Is there anything that you wanted to comment on in terms of anything that I just mentioned? Anything in terms of like, you know, your reaction to that, or anything that comes up, maybe that's sort of tangential to that conversation?
Yeah, I think the two of the points you made about like stability and coordination are things that I hear um, sort of like knocked or poo-pooed in like the evidence space crowd, because what they often come back to is like, well, there's not really much research to support the idea that stability is a relevant factor, and they might cite, well, there are almost no studies really investigating this, and there's one study where they compared squats like in a Smith machine to squats with free weight to squats on a Bosu ball, and there didn't seem to be much differences in the measures they were taking. When you actually read the study, it's a little like more nuanced than that. And even in the introduction, it's kind of funny because they talk about other studies that measured things like strength, which, as we've talked about before, is kind of a multi-layered thing, and really just a number of topics sort of melded into one. But they kind of come back to like, well, we don't really have evidence to support the idea that stability is an important factor, in hypertrophy. And it's likely that all exercises in the gym are probably stable enough. And I really doubt that for a lot of reasons. I think without, another thing before, I sort of go into my defense of that is they might cite things like in meta looking at free weight exercises versus like machine based exercises and just saying like, well, we don't really seem to see a difference in hypertrophy with machines versus free weight. So that's more evidence that stability really isn't that important. And I think the overall issue here is just zooming out too far.
Mm.
And one, it's like, what are the populations that we're looking at? That's something that people often come back to. And I don't think is always the most defensible argument. It's like, is it the same in beginners versus advanced? But in this situation, I think it's particularly relevant when you just say, like, how much muscle can a beginner use, or can a beginner make, or how much muscle can a beginner gain, on a with a given set of exercises versus another given set of exercises, given the fact that they've never really done either and don't really have much skill in either. But then even when you get into advanced, it's like, what have they been doing? What sort of skill do they have on that particular exercise? So there are major confounders in both instances, whether you use beginners or whether you use more advanced trainees. So I don't necessarily think that like one is so much better than the other.
Mm.
I think the overall point here is that the devil is in the details, and it's not a good way to answer the question looking at it that broadly. I think it's always relevant to just look at it really broadly and say, okay, like, I don't know, much like the length and partial study, where it was like, if we have one group that trains with these set of exercises and another group that trains with these other set of exercises, this was another like this a Milo study where it was just comparing like a very ecologically valid form of like lengthen bias training
Yeah.
versus the full range of motion.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he was a part of that. Yeah. It's the recent one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's another instance where it's like, okay, pretty ecologically valid. It doesn't really tell us why. It doesn't really give any specifics. So it's pretty easy to criticize on like a mechanistic level and on an individual level to say like, well, is this how I should train? It doesn't really answer that question, but it's reasonable to just say, okay, if we just throw a grenade out, like what happens? Can we answer that first and then maybe go in with the troops? Fine. Like I don't know that it would be the most interesting thing for like me to be a part of, but I think if you want to just like throw a bomb and kind of see what happens, we might just know that, all right, like the bomb approach doesn't work. But that doesn't mean that the individual pieces within that aren't important. It might be that we're just not looking at it with enough specificity. So I think just to say, oh, machines, we think of machines as stable, and free weights, we think of them as more unstable, and therefore stability doesn't matter. Or we compare two exercises, and again, the person doing it might not be matched for the right question that we're trying to answer. Like again, if we take an advanced person who's really skilled on one exercise, we put them on something they're unskilled at, maybe they appear to gain strength much faster on the thing that they're unskilled at. It's just one example of where the population really matters in terms of answering like which one is better. It's
Hmm.
very much like where did they start from? It's very much more about like what are the limitations that you're trying to address. And I think that's what's kind of being missed in all of this. For me, I just come back to the basic premise of like, it seems like in almost every area that we look at, whether it be like, do more calories help you build more muscle? Up to a certain point, and it sort of depends on how fast, how much of an ability you have to gain muscle at that given point. So if you're, a complete beginner and you can grow muscle really fast and you have the genetics for it and you have the right training environment, then sure, more calories, again, up to a certain point, will build muscle faster. And that might be a greater relative change from your sort of maintenance calories than it would be someone who's advanced. Maybe for them, they're not growing muscle as fast, therefore being in surplus isn't as important. And then we're like, well, does more protein help build more muscle? Again, same thing. Like, how fast is your ability to grow muscle right now? Are you training at really low volumes? Are you not sleeping very much? Like, do you have a lot of stress in your life? Well, adding more protein to that isn't going to make you grow any faster. Does more sets make you grow more muscle? Like, yeah, when you look at the average amongst all people and you just kind of like smooth out all of the variance within the population, yes, pretty much all of these things asymptote, and they all eventually have diminishing returns at some point. If we don't have enough data, they appear to be linear. Like, if you measure it at a given point, it just seems like more protein is better, more calories are better, more sets are better, training to failure is better. It's just everything, depending on how much data you have in the beginning, just kind of looks like, okay, you do more, you get more. And then at some point, like pretty much all biological processes, there's an asymptote, there's a point of diminishing returns. And I'll come back to this concept in a minute because it kind of dovetails into my next point. But my point here is, when you do an exercise, if you make it more stable, can you do more reps? And then you say, like, huh, it seems like training to failure gets me more muscle growth. Well, what happens when you train to failure? You do more reps. It seems like doing more sets gives you more muscle growth. Well, it's like, well, what happens when you do more sets? You do more reps. It kind of seems like when you do more reps, you grow more. So if you really have to ask the question, like, when I put a pad down on my thigh to do lat pull down, or I put a bench behind me to do a cable chest press, like when you can cable chest press an amount that makes you like a respectable human being in the gym, like standing up and doing a cable chest press, no matter how functional you think it is going to be very much limited by your ability to not be pulled backwards, right? So having a bench behind you makes a huge freaking difference. So do we really have to ask the question, like, does putting a bench behind me promote more hypertrophy? It might be a question of magnitude, but it's just simply like, how much does 5 more reps make you grow? The same as 5 more reps when you train to failure, the same as 5 more reps when you did another set. Like, you just set the thing up. Can you do more? If you can do more and you didn't change any of the other constraints, I feel pretty good about the fact that you'll grow more. Can I pick that up? Can we pick that up in the research based on the subjects being used, based on the conditions it's being studied in, based on what it's being compared against, based on the length of the study, based on the tool that we're using to make the measurement? Like, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure if you do it one way, you change nothing else, and you do it another way, and you can do more, I feel confident that that's a good thing. I don't know why we would have to dig into why we would use research that's so broad and non-specific to just say, hey, look, like, we threw a couple grenades out there and I can't tell what blew up, what did what. I feel pretty confident that, like, if you do more, like, it's going to be more.
Mhm.
So that would just be kind of my litmus test there, is like, if you make a thing more stable and you remove a limiter, I feel good that that's going to produce a positive result. Now, sometimes when you're comparing two different things, it's tough to judge, but you might be acutely aware. For example, like, are, do we need? I doubt Versagrips did a study. They'd be like, Versagrips produce more hypertrophy. They might have. That would be interesting. I don't know if you would pick it up in the research, but I feel confident that if you can't grip the weight to pull on stuff and you add Versagrips, I feel pretty good about the fact that that would promote more hypertrophy. Whether or not you could pick it up, I don't know. Like, that is a separate question of whether or not you can measure it. But if your limitation is you can't grip the shit, or your limitation is you can't balance, or your limitation is the skill on a specific thing, I feel pretty good about, if you pull out that limitation and you can do more, that it's going to, be a more efficient route, at least in the short term, to produce that result.
Mhm. And the one thing that I would add, just to going back to the initial comparison or point about the sort of extrapolation from those generalized studies is that if you were to say something along the lines of like, well, machines are more stable than free weights, you would be kind of missing the whole, I guess, point about stability that is actually relevant, which is that it's not inherently about the implement that you're using. It is about the systemic interaction of all the component parts, right? So it's not that like body weight exercise is more or less stable, right? Just as a general idea, it's more so about what you do with your body weight, how you're interacting with things around you. If you stand on one leg with your body weight, that is less stable, right? More difficult to balance than if you're using two legs. If you use one leg and then all of a sudden you grab a pole next to you, now all of a sudden you're pretty much as stable as you would have been having used two legs. So just there's nothing that is intrinsic to an implement or a category of motion that makes it more or less stable. It is within the actual component parts and how those component parts do or do not, interact with one another, right? So like, and especially in the case of free weights, the stronger that you get and the more load that you use, the more constraining, the more that the load becomes a source of stability, right? So like if you're doing a dumbbell chest press and you're using the 5 pound dumbbells, like you see this a lot with trainers who are trying to like teach clients new exercises, they'll give their clients like baby weights, you know, baby weights relative to what the person can handle, and they'll be able to basically just, sort of flip and flop their arms around, and they look like a baby deer that was just born, because of the fact that they're not using an amount of load that would otherwise have to constrain them to a particular path, right? The second that you give that person maybe, I don't know, 20 pounds, right, where they can maybe only do 5 or 8 reps, again, new trainee or something, now all of a sudden they can't just flop the weights around. They have to actually move it, within a specific path. So it's not only just a question of the type of implement and how you interact with it, but also how much the actual magnitude of the load is constraining to your emotion. And in the case of you, Ethan, in particular, you have to be especially mindful of these concepts because of the fact that the absolute loads that you're using are generally much higher than the average person. And so the second that there's something kind of misaligned or set up inappropriately from a stability perspective, you automatically will notice that deviation because of how much it matters the more that the load scales. So it's interesting just how much it can change even using the same implement in the same person. But then all of a sudden you compare different people who are stronger versus less strong, then I just think the importance, there's a very clear reason to me that most bodybuilders end up spending most of their time using machines and very sort of traditional dumbbell movements. And I think that while success in this domain doesn't tell us everything, it certainly tells us, I think, a lot about where most exercises tend to sort of gravitate toward in people who are the most muscular over the longest period of time. So, were you going to make an additional point there, or was that kind
Yeah,
of the end of where you were
thoughts
going?
on that. I mean, it's like that's what's funny about citing a study where it's like, oh, they did Bosu squats versus Smith machine squats. It's like you got to pay some credence to the fact that like no one is doing Bosu ball squats. Also, including the people who are talking about it could be just as good. Um,
Yeah.
why? I mean, you could say, oh, maybe it's a safety issue or whatever, but it's just like no one is actually doing that in practice. At some point, you have to pay attention to just like what do you actually, to your point, like what do you actually see in successful people, and just looking at those clues. Um, in terms of other follow up points here, um, let's see, that one got me kind of sidetracked. Where I was going to go with the whole conversation in terms of just looking at things on like a population level and looking at trends and saying like what is the optimal amount of training volume I should do, what is the optimal amount of protein I should eat or calories above maintenance or even sleep, as I mentioned earlier. Like all of these are individual lines of research, and in research, they're trying to isolate specific variables. And we're trying to, as best as possible, control for other factors, isolate these variables, and find out on average what range people tend to see uh, benefits in. And oftentimes it's presented as a range. So, for example, like with protein, the most common recommendations now are like 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein based on body weight, or 2 to 2.75 grams per pound of lean body mass, which almost like no one really knows their lean body mass, so we mostly just go off of body weight. But we have these ranges, and then we say, who, what, where, when, those sort of things. So, it could be a pretty big range. And we might say things like, well, if we look at me and my wife, for example, it's okay, male, female. Does that really make a difference? Doesn't seem to be a lot of differences, gender wise with this sort of stuff. We talk about just like, do we see the same general trend with SATs, training to failure, calories, protein, sleep, etc.? Well, body mass is pretty different. I probably have about double, a little less than double the body mass she does. So on a relative basis, that's why they give these recommendations via pounds, right? Where they say like, okay, it's 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram, or zero point 0.8 to 1 gram per pound, somewhere in there. So that's already scaled based on body weight. And then we might look at things like, well, is this person more beginner, like my wife would be, or more advanced, like I am? And how does that affect the amount of sets they should do? How does that affect the amount of protein they should eat? How does that affect how much of a surplus they should be in? So it's not uncommon to say like, oh, a beginner, only needs this amount of sets to grow. So maybe like the minimum effective dose for volume is, lower in a beginner, but the minimum effective dose for volume as you become more advanced goes up. Like the amount you need to maintain, the amount you need to make some amount of progress probably goes up over time. But does that mean that like the beginner wouldn't benefit from doing more than the minimum? No. So is it possible that the amount of sets that a beginner could be doing is actually the same as someone more advanced? Yeah. So I'm just pulling out a few different lines of research and just saying like, here are ways that we're generally looking at these trends. So with calories, another one that's come up recently is, well, maybe the more advanced you are, the less of a caloric surplus you want to be in, just simply because you're not growing as fast. So maybe for her, on a relative basis, maybe relatively she could be in a little bit more of a caloric surplus if she was really, pushing training hard. And maybe relatively, I would be in a little bit less of a caloric surplus if I wasn't, theoretically growing as fast, just because I would be closer to a genetic ceiling. Yeah.
Just to interject there, I'm giggling because there's a new trend now that bulking is dead, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if you were aware of that, but that is something people are now saying, which I think what they mean is um, don't get fat too quickly. But like it's not, in terms of the messaging, it's a little bit too clickbaity for me. Like,
Yeah, it still lives on this diminishing returns, right? Like eating more food at no point from a like physiological level per se makes you grow slower. Like that was the question with sets, right? Like, is there a number of sets where you actually start growing slower on sort of like a signaling like individual muscle level? Like when we do studies where we're just looking at a muscle group or two and you're doing 40 sets a week, like is that ever just like on average, for all the participants on average produce less results? And it just seems like, again, when you're looking at the mean with all of these things, doing more doesn't generally get you less. It's just simply that you get less and less returns the more you do. So you're just spending more and getting less per dollar as you do more and more. So I think in all these different areas, I mentioned sleep before. It's like moving from 6 hours to 8 hours of sleep in terms of your recovery, or shoot, like 4 hours to 6 hours, very meaningful. 6 to 8, still pretty meaningful. 8 to 10, if you're a professional athlete, might matter a little bit, but do you get worse? Not necessarily. Like you can actually look at some of the research when it's more on like mortality, all cause mortality and disease risk. And it's like, well, actually, sleeping more seems to be worse for health outcomes. And it's like, yeah, because who sleeps all the time? Like people who are sick.
Yeah.
So in general, you just kind of like the same trends across the board where it's like, sure, if you can do more of something theoretically, you can benefit more. And we just start siloing each of these things and asking that same question over and over again. Like, if I eat more, if I train more, if I sleep more, like, do I get more benefit? And it seems universally like the answer is yes. And that eventually you get to diminishing returns. And while I think just knowing sort of what that curve looks like and putting numbers to it is very relevant. If you just have if you know nothing about training and you want to get into lifting and you're just like, uh, how many sets should I start at? How much protein should I eat? Like the answer is always just more than before, and you'll get a benefit. You know, if you're currently sedentary and you walk, you get a benefit. If you're currently eating, you know, zero point 0.3 grams per kilogram of protein and you move to, double, triple that, like you're going to get more. But understanding the nature of that curve and sort of the shape of it, of where on average people start to get diminishing returns, I think is still pretty relevant. But at the end of the day, the more that you can tolerate, the more that you can budget, the more that you can build into your schedule from just like a time standpoint, pretty much the more you're going to get. But what I don't really hear talked about as much, and it's by no means like a unique concept, it's something that's just, come up before and kind of getting lost a little bit now, and it'll come back again. And something that we've talked about many times here is just the concept of like rate limiting steps versus looking at it as like, how much protein should I eat? How many sets should I do? Like, how much sleep do I need to get? Like, even your stress levels in your life. If you look at each of these individually, I think on their own, as you move from someone who's completely novice to even just a very base level of competence in these behaviors, and these sort of individual stimuli, stresses, and ways to sort of recover from these stresses, you have to really put them all together and you have to stop seeing them in silos. If you think about it on an extreme level, it's like, how much protein do you need to build muscle if you're not lifting at all? Well, it's like, well, that doesn't really matter anymore, does it? Because you don't have the stimulus there. Like, how much training do you need to do to overcome not sleeping? Well, you
Mhm.
can't really do much at all. And, when you actually train people in the real world, like we hear about this topic of stress and the biopsychosocial model, but man, it's pretty incredible when you measure in a more advanced person whether or not they're making progress in a very stressful time. When you have all the other things in place, it's like we've seen previously that this training volume worked. We're trying different iterations of it, more of it, less of it. We've, at an appropriate caloric balance, protein amount. If it's someone who's enhanced, maybe they're on a course and they're taking drugs at that time. Their sleep hasn't been perturbed by the stress. Like all the other things that are in play, but they're just emotionally dysregulated, and you're measuring performance changes or body composition changes tend to be even more sensitive. And you're just like, man, everything kind of has to be in play at a certain point. And I think it's less about trying to dial one of these up and just saying what's the right number. And I think it's more about getting them to play together. if you take someone who is considered a beginner and you just say, all right, if we add training volume, what happens? They grow more. And if you take someone who's been training for a while, but they've been doing in a caloric deficit, and you put them in a surplus, they grow more. If they weren't eating a lot of protein, they grow more. If they weren't sleeping or they had a super stressful lifestyle, they grow more. So when any of these things are at sort of like a zero baseline, moving them up on their own really tends to move the needle because it's the rate limiting step in the process.
Hmm.
And it's really easy to identify in that situation. It's like you're not training at all, you're not eating enough, you're not recovering well. Like, and you move any of those dials, and it's just everything goes up because you address the thing that was at zero. But when all of them are, on this arbitrary scale where it's like your training's at a 7 and your nutrition's at a 6 and your sleep's at a 4, and these kind of imaginary dials, what I observe in the real world is you can have the training at a 10, but if the nutrition is at a 6, the diminishing returns on the training are astronomical.
Hmm.
And it's less about trying to identify optimal in any given range, and it's more about identifying the weakest link. And that weakest link or rate limiting step moves the needle so much more than moving another thing up that isn't limiting you.
Mm.
So I think that there's such a bigger magnitude of change. It's easy to, again, to identify in the person starting from zero in a given thing or a theoretical zero. Like we're all sleeping some amount, we're all training some amount, we're all eating some amount. But the zero could like zero for calories could simply be maintenance, and negative, could be a deficit. So moving from the deficit to maintenance or to a surplus uh, is going to tend to move the needle as far as growth in a pretty meaningful way for a person. But then
Mm.
moving from a little bit of a surplus to a little bit more and a little bit more than that, over time it becomes less and less noticeable. But what I see in practice a lot of times is that people are moving dials. Like, for example, you'll have like trainers who aren't particularly focused on their nutrition in terms of just like measuring things like being in good habits and like being consistent as far as their intake. Like they want to gain muscle, but they haven't gained weight in 10 years. And it's like, well, how much training volume should I do? And it
Mm.
matters, but I think it's really more about having these things in sync. And I think the more advanced you become, the more all of those things need to be playing together at the same time. So you need to ask yourself, like, if I'm in a really stressful environment, like, is this going to be the right time to turn the other dials? And when those dials have a cost, that's when it becomes really, really relevant. So that's where, in the beginning, where your training volumes are pretty innocuous, like for a general population personal training client, like they could be sick, they could be on vacation for a couple of weeks, they come back, and it's just like no matter what you do with the training volume, they're kind of more or less in the same place. Like stress doesn't tend to perturb it too much. Like their nutrition, day to day, what they ate before, like nothing tends to perturb something that's operating at a pretty low baseline, where it's like you're driving a Formula One car around the track and everything really has to be dialed in. Like the
Hmm.
risks are much higher, and small shifts show up as big changes.
Right.
So,
A good comparison there for just to draw it back to an earlier analogy was stronger people and the amount of attention to detail that you need when you're stronger to make sure that things are in place, both from a muscular stimulus perspective, but also obviously like an injury perspective as well.
yeah, that's right. It's just like, what are the costs? Because if you're doing higher training volumes in a position where you don't have the other requisite pieces in play to grow, you're paying a price unnecessarily.
Hmm.
And if
Hmm.
you're really strong and you train at really high volumes and you don't back off of those at a time when you don't have the other where you don't have a rate limiter um, sort of brought up, when there's something else that is going to greatly impede your progress, you're paying a cost for that. Like if you have to eat so many calories that it is just emotionally exhausting, it's taxing on your digestive system, maybe it, impacts your sleep at a given body weight, doing that at a time where you're not going to be putting on much muscle because your training's not in place, maybe because you're injured, or you're in a stressful position in life. Like those are times where you really need to consider pulling back on a number of variables because each of them come with an associated cost. And it's just simply like a lot of times you want to lay your chips down at the same time and get them to all play together because it's not like a 1 plus 1 equals 2. There's synergy here. Like it's the 1 plus 1 plus 1, equal 7 kind of deal.
Hmm.
So I think if you just think about it as a linear relationship where each of these are individual, where it's just like training has this many chips and nutrition has this many chips and other parts of your recovery like sleep gives you this many chips. And if I just add 5 training chips, I move up 5 points. It's like, no, if you add 5 training chips, you also have to add the other chips that
Hmm.
go with it. And I think it's more about the interaction between those pieces than it is the individual parts. And I think because we're in a place now where people have so much access to research and just dialogue about these conversations, we're sort of missing oftentimes the interaction and when the right time to sort of this synergy between the individual parts and how to sort of synchronize that because that is very much like an art. It's a harder thing to just say this is optimal, that is optimal, but managing fatigue is really the art of when to push and when to pull back, and that becomes particularly relevant as the costs become higher, as you can become more advanced, and as you need more pieces in play to really manifest a change.
Yeah, and I think what you're like the first thing that comes to mind for me insofar as the how this relates to the initial conversation is just that this kind of like theory of constraints that you're describing occurs on the level of every exercise that you do. And when I'm thinking about, let's say, fixing a problem, I'll give a concrete example. So I had consultation with a trainer a couple weeks ago because one of his clients was kind of struggling with dumbbell presses. And well, the question was like, why is this client struggling and sort of what should I do to fix it? And the temptation and just in terms of the specifics of the struggle, like this particular client's like arms were literally like I had never seen anything like it before. It was like one arm was like 90 degrees out, the other was like 45. This hand was like one of her hands was closer in, this one was farther. And so it just looked like a kind of like a circus act, dumbbell press. It was very unusual. Um, and if it was just like a slight asymmetry, I'd probably say don't worry about it. But it was like, oh my God, these look like two different people. And so applying the sort of theory of constraints to that particular case uh, is very helpful because you could change 20 things about the exercise, right, on one go. But when you have, we'll say, more experience coaching people, you come to recognize that there are many common rate limiters that if you just address the rate limiters, a lot of sort of downstream things tend to correct themselves. And so in this case, it was literally like this trainer's client was number one was not centered on the bench. She was literally just offset to one side. And her hands were not centered on the dumbbells. And so then once those two things were fixed, everything else, she was able to add more load. When she was able to add more load, she was more constrained by the load of the dumbbells. And so just addressing just those two setup things corrected the really wonky sort of asymmetry that prevented her from actually being able to add more load. And then once that more load was added, right, she was able to sort of press more smoothly, allowing her to press more load right in future weeks. And so you change these one or two things, and it's like there's a domino effect that occurs. And I think that occurs at within every exercise. And most of the time, if you pay close attention, the rate limiter in terms of like exercise execution, usually in my experience, you can maybe agree or disagree with this. It either tends to be like the counter forces that people are creating, like the stability, the anchoring, whatever you want to call it, or the comfort. It usually tends to be how stable or how uncomfortable or comfortable is this person. And things that are sort of outside of that tend to I don't want to, maybe this is the wrong way to say it, but they tend to correct themselves, right? Oh, I'm getting pain in this triceps extension. If I move my hands in this different spot, now the pain goes away. All of a sudden, the load takes care of itself. All of a sudden, my shoulder stops bugging me, or whatever it happens to be. I think that when we take the example of like the leg extension in comparison to the reverse Nordic, when you're doing an exercise like the reverse Nordic, it's not like readily available to you to understand like what exactly is holding you back, right? It's kind of like, this feels like it's just like harder to coordinate. I don't exactly know what changes I can easily make to make this feel better. Whereas with the leg extension, it's kind of like, do I have the right load? Is the pad kind of in a position that's comfortable? And can I like add more load over time? And so like I kind of feel like the more obvious the constraints become to the person, the easier it is for that person to then navigate changes across time within that exercise. And the more obvious it is to people just how much these kinds of things, I think, um, matter insofar as they're able to make changes over time. Because, like I said, if you have 10 different things that you could potentially change about an exercise, it's not that that makes that exercise bad, but just in terms of the whole, creation of a bigger target. To me, it's helpful to choose exercises that have that bigger target so that you only have a couple of things to sort of fuck up. And you only have a couple of things potentially to correct for. So on the specific note of like the comfort and the stability, I just kind of feel like there are definitely some variables. Like it's wrong to say that some variables are infinitely more important than others. But like if I have to choose between, which I don't, but if I have to choose between worrying about the muscle length and worrying about uh the stability and the comfort, like the stability and the comfort are to me are prerequisites. They're like more bedrock than something like a muscle length conversation. So when you're making exercise decisions, I think you have to address those initial layers first because those, as you're saying, are kind of like nutrition, sleep, training volume. Those are kind of going to be the things that um, create the map to begin with, and then you can worry about things like muscle length and rep range and range of motion and cueing and all those sorts of things. So, in terms of the comfort and pain points, do you kind of agree with that, or do you see muscle length as something that is kind of more, I guess, primary in a sense?
No, I mean, I see from this particular angle, I see muscle length as moving the magnitude of the stimulus.
Mhm.
Now, there might be other reasons, like just again in this specific context. Like I think there are other reasons to manipulate muscle length,
Yeah.
you know, ranging from like orthopedic concerns to specificity of performance, like to recovery from injuries. Like there are a lot of ways you could look at muscle length, but in this particular context, when people say what's better, they're asking like what grows more muscle. So we're talking about it from the perspective of magnitude, and you can always do more of something. Like even if there's a difference in magnitude, it's not just simply which one's more potent. It's really like which one is practically going to allow you to achieve the end result, like to get the greatest magnitude of stimulus. And if you just said, "Oh, I can only do one set," which one is better? I think a lot of times that's the wrong way to look at it. So in this instance, if you want to be able to accumulate the most over time, I think the idea of comfort and stability, which are sort of like have feedback on each other. It's sort of like a loop. Sometimes the stability can add comfort, and in this particular case, I think it just lends to being able to accumulate more volume over time, and you can always layer length on top of that.
Mm,
You might slightly have to change the position you're doing it from, but if you start from the premise of, I want to make this exercise as survivable, as tolerable as possible, I want to be able to do the most of this thing that I possibly can, then afterwards you can sort of add, well, then how much of it do I want to do? And I think in the conversation of hypertrophy, you can start from either end. You can start from, usually when someone's really like orthopedically challenged, we'll say, you often start from, let's just find anything that's comfortable. And then we'll just scale up the magnitude. When you start sort of from this like conceptual scratch, which like often doesn't happen, you might just say, all right, I'm going to start by trying to find something that creates a length and bias, and then I'll try to set it up to be comfortable afterwards. Yeah, sometimes you can do that as well. It kind of depends on the client and the circumstance that you're working with. But usually magnitude is kind of like a secondary variable to your point.
mhm. Yeah, and I think that oftentimes when the conversation starts with muscle length, we have already kind of trapped ourselves in a particular box. Um, and I think that specifically when these conversations occur publicly or when people are quote unquote educating others about muscle length, um, that's not inherently like a bad thing, right? It's not like a bad thing to just talk about a topic and be like, hey, this is something that might be important for you. But I just feel like people are in the box of muscle length and they're unaware that they're in the box of muscle length. And that to me becomes a problem. Whereas just understanding that muscle length is a piece to the puzzle is not necessarily. So I think that if there's any takeaway, it's not that like doing a reverse Nordic would be bad. It's just that there are many things that you should consider, especially for someone who is training other people, um, because trapping yourself in those boxes, I think, by definition, prevents you from making certain changes, right? You have these kind of assumptions that you're almost unaware of, um, to sort of think outside the box, so to speak, to use that common quip or aphorism. So, in terms of like overall conclusions, um, I would say that I have nothing against reverse Nordics. Personally, I just have something against the communication, and I wouldn't really bring this up as much as I do with you, Ethan, in particular, if I didn't think that people weren't actually being affected by it. Um, but just based on the questions that I receive, and this is not an exaggeration, like multiple times a day, there are replies to a story or a post that say something like, well, isn't this worse than this other thing? I think everything can just come back to what, in the example you gave, the big pillars first, and then I think zooming in on any individual variable is perfectly fine. Again, as long as you have an awareness um, of that broader picture. And I have fallen for the trap myself of just kind of talking about these things and maybe overemphasizing the importance of certain variables that is born of a necessity just for content creators to make content. Like I think this is where a lot of this stuff even comes from in the first place. Is just that people feel like they need to say something, right? Like as content creators, that's kind of your job is to like say stuff and make positions and provide value to people. And so I'm not bashing that, and I'm not saying that that isn't important to, a content creator's job. Like that's my job as well. But I just think that there are much better ways that we can, as content creators, go about this. And the way that I try to problem solve for that is just by providing enough context to give people the understanding that, if I make a 10-minute YouTube video, that you should not assume that this 10-minute YouTube video applies in every context all the time. Like if I'm saying, hey, this tricep extension might be a better option for you and you might want to try it, that's very different from me saying that this is the best thing for you under all conditions and this is the worst thing for you under all conditions. So I think that to some degree, there's no way around this being a thing that I as a content creator will need to like battle with because it is an opportunity cost to some degree to like be responding to other people rather than to just be talking about the things that I think are important. But I do think that some balance of that is necessary, and I think that it is appreciated as long as um, things don't turn personal. Because ultimately, I don't know someone like Milo personally to any degree. Seems like a normal guy, nice guy. But when it comes to these kinds of things, I tend to get a bit frustrated just because um, I think unnecessarily limiting people's options is I think it's just a silly thing to do when it comes to exercise. And I think that it really, prevents people from having good experiences in the gym. Like someone came up to me the other day in the gym and said that they had back pain doing bent over rows, and I said, well, like let's just, what's your goal? Is your goal just to like train, your lats and your upper back? And this person I just told like, hey, you can just go use the chest support machine, that was like 10 feet away from us, instead. And so those kinds of changes, they seem kind of trivial, but they can ultimately create a really good experience of a workout or a really not so good experience of a workout. And I think that just the more time you spend training, the more that you recognize that is like kind of an essential feature, just being able to kind of um, change directions when you need and not getting caught in particular bubbles or boxes is a big part of that. So, um, any other final points you wanted to make on that, or you feel like that was closed loop?
I was just trying to play devil's advocate and think to myself, like, why don't I do this like Nordic leg extension or whatever you call it? Like, why don't I do it with my clients? Like, what's my bias? Like, I don't really think about it. I don't have any like personal vendetta about it. Like, I just try to frame it as like if a study came out and it showed that in 10 sets a week of that Nordic leg extension versus the leg extension machine that they happen to use in the study produces 50% more growth. Would I, consider using like the Nordic leg extension, and what reasons might, I just naturally gravitate away from that. And it comes back to the whole like machines versus free weight exercise discussion earlier. And I had one more thought on that I couldn't pull from my brain. So I just went off on kind of the rate limiting conversation, which was this idea that there are sort of more options and more sort of degrees of freedom, like in a free weight exercise. So in this like dumbbell bench press example that you gave, or a dumbbell row, for example, once you get to an amount of load that's actually going to be stimulative, there's not really any other direction that the weight can go besides down towards the floor.
Mhm.
And when you get in a machine, you have an option in terms of where do you sit, where do you stand, do you kneel, do you add a handle to it? You don't have to necessarily pull in the exact direction that the machine is moving in, or you don't have to balance a weight. It doesn't have to sit in your hand exactly the same way a dumbbell does. So a lot of times moving to machines actually gives me more movement options.
Mm,
And I think maybe some of the misinterpretations, or some of the divide here is just simply like the populations, people have worked with. Like if you've, had to work with people in pain in a resistance training environment, or you yourself has had a lot of pain. And a big concern is like orthopedic health and sustainability of this long term, which is something that also becomes a division based on how long people have been training. So often when people have been doing something for very long, they tend to say like what's best. And when people have been doing something for a long time, they're just like what's most survivable. And it's kind of like the tortoise and the hare type of thing. Like
mhm,
they realize that it's more just about your action over time and area under the curve. And you want to just do the thing that you can tolerate the best, that you enjoy the most, that you're just going to be able to accumulate the most of over time. And that's sort of the wisdom that comes along, I think, with experience, with maturity, and just with breaking things. And not everyone, some people are just lucky enough where they don't really break too many things. They don't have to problem solve. They don't work with people that have a lot of limitations. But I think working with that population and having been in those places myself, that's really what I'm aiming for, as per my conversation before about rate limiters. I think in resistance training, orthopedic health is one of the greatest rate limiters and one of the things that takes people away from training long term, most often. And when it comes to the whole like machines versus free weights or body weight exercises, I think even just the premise that those are real things, that like I understand, factories make machines and they, call them a chest press machine, and that they make benches, they make dumbbells, and you can do a lot of things on the bench and you can do a lot of things with the dumbbell. But in my mind, when you get on a bench and you do a dumbbell row or you do a bench press, you've created a machine. You've created a scenario where there are forces acting on your body that you can't necessarily augment. Like there are just some fixed variables that are what they are. That dumbbell is falling towards the ground. You can change the angle of the bench. Sometimes when you're using like a barbell, or like pressing in this example, like, you might change the direction that you're pressing, or you might change your intent, but at the end of the day, like that free weight is still falling towards the floor, and
Mhm.
that those forces don't change. So my mind never really goes to like, is this categorically free weight? Is this categorically body weight? Is this categorically a machine? They're really just all the same thing, with different, constraints within them. So I think that separation is more a separation for just how we categorize things, from a like sales perspective, or from just an ease of identification. But I don't think it really has that much of a place in terms of like what's a better choice exercise wise. It doesn't really mean anything to me at all.
Mhm.
So I think oftentimes this notion of like using free weights somehow offers more movement options versus using machines. I think it's oftentimes, if we are arbitrarily creating those categories, I think it's oftentimes the opposite. And the reason why I might choose a leg extension versus, say, the Nordic, version, is the amount of adjustability that I have within it. And I think when you've been in that position or you work with that population and you're motivated to learn about just how much you can adjust within a machine versus how difficult that can be to adjust in a situation that we call body weight, or a situation that we call free weight. When you realize just the multitude of options that exist within the manipulations of a machine and how that can change the ability to repeat that exercise and the sustainability of the exercise over time, um, it has such a big magnitude on the survivability of things. And I think that's why in practice, I really lean more towards something like a leg extension, because I know when things go wrong, which they inevitably will, there are a lot of pieces that I can move on there to make it more sustainable. And I can set it up for that person on that set under the conditions that we're in. And I can achieve what I'm looking for on that individual set with many different adjustments. So the more you're aware, I think, of those adjustments that you can make on a machine, the more you start to just value that as opposed to a single variable of magnitude, like muscle length.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think that on a technical level, we might be able to say that with these quote unquote body weight or free weight types of things, that the constraints still exist to a high degree, but they just kind of exist in a different way than they exist on a machine. A machine moves in a single path, like a chest press machine moves in a single path in a way that You being able to adjust your body position, bench angle, arm angle doesn't, right? I can press narrow with dumbbells or wide, but I can only grab the machine in one specific way. It's kind of like the constraints are different, but the constraints on really any machine are not really like center of mass dependent on you, right? So like in a free weight squat, let's say versus a leg press, in the free weight squat, you were constrained by not being able to, at least hopefully, fall forward or backward. But there's no concern about the leg press machine falling in in any direction, hopefully. So in effect, you are constrained in the sense of the leg press by the path of the leg press, but in another sense, you are unconstrained by any balance component. Whereas with the free weight stuff, the body weight stuff, you are constrained by where your body is actually capable of balancing relative to the resistance, but you are unconstrained in other ways. To, to take the leg press example versus the free squat, you can adjust your stance, let's say, in both cases, but the amount of adjustability to the stance in something like a leg press is far greater, right? Assuming that the foot plate isn't unusually small or something like that. So it's kind of interesting just to identify how there are constraints to both, but oftentimes the constraints with machines allow for greater windows of adjustability, specifically because of the fact that, let's say, in the case of a leg extension, the load can be pretty much toggled to the user's need. Whereas in something like the reverse Nordic, the load can only be adjusted to some degree based on what you're able to do, whether it's loading or unloading yourself. So, I mean, that's a really interesting conversation actually, because, and that gives a whole different conversation on its own, exercise to exercise. But I think that's probably a good place to leave it. And I think if there's any takeaway from that, it should simply be that if you are maybe closed-minded to the idea that machines could be or could allow for a greater degree of adjustability, that you might want to rethink that and potentially play around with the machines that you have access to, if in the past you maybe have perceived them to be limiting you in some way. So, all right, everyone, we will resume podcasting next week. What we will be talking about, we don't know. You don't know, and that is the modern meathead experience in a nutshell.